Okay, as we're all sitting around waiting with bated breath for this report to come from the Pentagon regarding the UFOs this month, being June 2021, I thought I'd have a very quick look at the Roswell incident report that's on the NSA file, on the NSA site rather. Here we go. So we go nsa.gov/portals. So this is a sort of Freedom of Information Act document, government document. It's not been written by some spotty half-wit in a garden shed. Sorry, edit suite. So I think what will happen is that the people that are putting this UFO, can't remember what they call it now, unidentified object task force that's going to be producing this report, that's going to be released this month, they're going to say, okay, we're going to look at this and look at this and look at this. What have we got on Roswell? Because all the UFO nuts are going to jump on that one. That's the one they want to see. That's the one they want to read about. They want to get the nitty-gritty of the Roswell story. And they'll say, well, there was actually a really thorough investigation into all the documentation relating to the Roswell incident way back in 1994. It was done at the request of a congressman from New Mexico. And there's been nothing new on the matter since. So here's the report that was put together in 1994, and I think it won't be expanded on beyond that. So this is the report that was put together in 1994. We can see it's July 1994. Hopefully you can see the little cursor moving around. The report of the Air Force research regarding the Roswell incident, in quote marks, and this is on the nsa.gov/portals documents blah 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 website. Okay, so we'll move it up a bit. That hasn't turned the mic off. I did that before, and I recorded about half an hour of this, and there was no bloody sound. So probably what I should have done was, hang on, I'm just getting the hang of this. It's amateurish, I know, but I'm an amateur. There we go. Report of Air Force research regarding the Roswell incident, in quote marks, July 1994, executive summary. Okay. So we'll just read a bit of this. I'm not going to read the whole 22 pages out because you'll fall asleep much faster than you normally do when you're watching one of my videos. So I'll just read some bits that I think are sort of interesting or relevant. The Roswell incident, in quote marks, refers to an event that supposedly happened in July 1947, wherein the Army Air Forces, in brackets AAF, allegedly recovered remains of a crashed flying disc, in quote marks, near Roswell, New Mexico. In February 1994, the General Accounting Office, the GAO in brackets, acting on the request of a New Mexico congressman, initiated an audit to attempt to locate records of such an incident and to determine if records regarding it were properly handled. Although the GAO effort was to look at a number of government agencies, the apparent focus was on the Air Force. SAF is Secretary of the Air Force. Not quite sure what AAZ is, but it'll be in the glossary. As the central point of contact for the GAO in this matter, initiated a systematic research of current Air Force offices, as well as numerous archives and record centers that might help explain this matter. Research revealed that the Roswell incident, in quote marks, was not even considered a UFO event until the 1978-1980 time frame. Prior to that, the incident was dismissed because the Army Air Force originally identified the debris recovered as being that of a weather balloon. Subsequently, various authors wrote a number of books claiming that not only was debris from an alien spacecraft recovered, but also the bodies of the craft's alien occupants. These claims continue to evolve today, and the Air Force is now routinely accused of engaging in a cover-up, in quote marks, of this supposed event. The research located no records at existing Air Force offices that indicated any cover-up, in quote marks, by the United States Air Force or any indication of such a recovery. Consequently, efforts were intensified by the Air Force researchers at numerous locations where records for the period in question were stored. The records review did not reveal any increase in operations, security, or any other activity in July 1947 that indicated any such unusual event may have occurred. Records were located investigated and thoroughly explored concerning a then top-secret balloon project designed to attempt to monitor Soviet nuclear tests known as Project Mogul. Additionally, several surviving project personnel were located and interviewed, as was the only surviving person who recovered debris from the original Roswell site in 1947. That was Lieutenant Colonel Gov't, and the former officer who initially identified the wreckage as a balloon. Comparison of all information developed or obtained indicated that the material recovered near Roswell was consistent with a balloon device, most likely from one of the Mogul balloons that had not been previously recovered. Air Force research efforts did not disclose any records of the recovery of any alien, in quote marks, bodies or extraterrestrial materials. Okay. Introduction. Air Force involvement in the alleged UFO-related incident, popularly known as the Roswell Incident, in quote marks, began as a result of a January 14, 1994 Washington Post article, attachment 1, which announced Congressman Stephen Schiff's intent to initiate a General Accounting Office GAO effort to resolve this controversial matter. Having previously been involved in numerous Freedom of Information Act and congressional requests on unusual aircraft, in quote marks, to include identified flying objects, UFOs, in brackets, the Director Security and Special Program Oversight Office of the Secretary of the Air Force, the SAF and the AAZ, believed the Air Force should become involved in any GAO effort involving this subject. Thus, in late January 1994, the Secretary of the Air Force and the AAZ directed its research/declassification team to attempt to locate any official records relative to this matter. These initial research efforts focused on records at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, I'm guessing that is, the Air Force Safety Agency at Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico, and National Archives and Records Administration. On February the 15th, 1994, the GAO officially notified the Secretary of Defense, William J. Perry, that it was initiating an audit of the Department of Defense policies and procedures for acquiring, classifying, retaining, and disposing of official government documents dealing with weather balloons, aircraft, similar crash incidents, attachment 2 in brackets. This notification was subsequently passed to the Department of Defense Inspector General, who in turn officially notified the Secretaries of the Services and other affected parties of the audit in a February 23, 1994 memo, see attachment 3. This memorandum indicated that the GAO is anxious to respond to Representative Schiff's request to dispel any concerns that the Department of Defense is being unresponsive. These were the first official US government documents that indicated that the purpose of the GAO was to review crash incidents involving weather balloons and unknown aircraft such as UFOs and foreign aircraft, and 2, the facts involving the reported crash of a UFO in 1949, something 1947 of Roswell, New Mexico, an alleged DoD cover-up. Okay, so entrance meeting of potentially concerned parties was held in the offices of the Department of Defense Inspector General, February 28, 1994. During this meeting, it was learned that while the audit officially would be reviewing the records of a number of DoD and possibly other executive branch entities, the bulk of the effort would be focused on the Air Force records and systems. The audit was officially given the GAO code, blah blah blah, and entitled Records Management Procedures Dealing with Weather Balloons, Unknown Aircraft and Similar Crash Incidents. Although this official title appeared rather broad, there was no misunderstanding that the real purpose was to attempt to locate records and or information on the Roswell Incident. In quote marks, this incident, explained later in more detail, generally dealt with the claim that in July of 1947 the US Army Air Force recovered a flying saucer and or its alien occupants which supposedly crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. When the United States Air Force ultimately became Army Air Force, rather, yeah. When the United States Army Air Force ultimately became the United States Air Force in September 1947, the USAF inherited equipment, personnel, records, policies and procedures from the Army Air Force. In this particular case, the Air Force also inherited the allegation that it had covered up the Roswell incident and has continued to do so for the next 47 years. Remember, this was written in 1994. So it would be plus 27 years. Within the Air Force, the Office of Administrative Assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force is responsible for both the information management procedures, the security policy and oversight. Because of this organization, SAFAA was the logical entity to assist the Government Audit Office in its audit, and the Secretary of the Air Force was officially named as the central point of contact for this endeavour. Okay, so they're taking it seriously. They're talking to the right people. They're talking to the people that are going to have the information, basically. Learned that this was indeed blah blah blah. As I said, I'm not going to read all of this, but this is what I think is going to be presented as part of this UFO release package stuff this month. It won't be in. There'll be no new information for this story, so this will be the report that'll be it, done and dusted as far as they're concerned. The Roswell Incident, in quote marks, that was originally reported in 1947, the modern preoccupation with what ultimately came to be called unidentified flying objects, actually began in June 1947. Although some pro-UFO researchers argue that sightings of UFOs go back to biblical times, most researchers will not dispute that anything in UFO history can compare with a phenomenon that began in 1947. What was later characterized as the UFO wave of 1947 began with 16 alleged sightings that occurred between May the 17th and July the 12th, 1947. Although some researchers claim there were as many as 800 sightings during that period, in brackets. Interestingly, the Roswell Incident was not considered one of these 1947 events until the 1978-1980 time frame. There is no dispute, however, that something happened near Roswell in July 1947, since it was reported in a number of contemporary newspaper articles, the most famous of which were the July 8th and July 9th editions of the Roswell Daily Record. And there was a statement made by Mac Brazel to the Roswell Daily Record on July the 8th, I think it was, or the 7th. And he told them in the statement exactly what he found, which was balsa wood sticks, rubber strips, scotch tape. Basically, it was nothing spectacular. It was what he was describing was debris from a balloon string. The July 8 edition reported Roswell Army Air Force captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region, while the next day's edition reported Ramey empties Roswell saucer and harassed rancher who located saucer. He told about it. And that probably relates to people badgering Brazel to tell them the story. He probably thought, why on earth did I do this? You know, I've got all these people outside, all I want to do is have a cup of tea and listen to the radio, probably. And he's got people knocking on his door asking him all sorts of questions. So that'll be, it won't be government harassment. That'll just be harassment from the general public. The first story reported that the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group stationed at Roswell Army Airfield, Ranger Jesse A. Marcel, recovered a flying disc from the rangelands of an unidentified rancher in the vicinity of Roswell, and that the disc had been flown to higher headquarters. That story also reported that a Roswell couple claimed to have seen a large unidentified object fly by their home on July the 2nd, 1947. Now, Brazel found the wreckage in his field, the wreckage that became known as the Roswell wreckage, in his field on June the 14th. Okay, well before July the 2nd, so this has got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with it. The July 9 edition of the paper noted that Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth, Texas, stated that upon examination, the debris recovered by Marcel was determined to be a weather balloon. The wreckage was described as a bundle of tinfoil, broken wood beams, and rubber remnants of a balloon. The additional story of the harassed rancher, in quote marks, identified him as W.W. Brazel of Lincoln County, New Mexico. He claimed that he and his son Vernon found the material on June the 14th. Oh, there you go. This is pretty much what he told the Roswell Daily Record, but I'll still leave a link to the Daily Roswell, the Brazel statement in the newspaper below as well, so you can read what he actually said. This is pretty much what he said anyway. His son Vernon found the material on June the 14th, 1947, when they came upon a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tin foil, rather tough paper, and sticks. He picked up some of the debris on July the 4th, and the next day, first heard about the flying discs and wondered if what he'd found might have been the remnants of one of these. Brazel subsequently, I think he also heard that there was a reward, a financial reward for anyone finding any parts of any flying discs. Brazel subsequently went to Roswell on July the 7th and contacted the sheriff, who apparently notified Major Marcel. Major Marcel and a man in plain clothes, that would have been Lieutenant Colonel Gov't, I think he was Captain Gov't at the time, then accompanied Brazel home to pick up the rest of the pieces. The article further related that Brazel thought that the material might have been as large as a tabletop. The balloon which held it up, if that was how it worked, must have been about 12 feet long, he felt, measuring the distance by the size of the room in which he sat. The rubber was a smoky grey in colour, scattered over an area of about 200 yards in diameter. When the debris was gathered up, the tin foil, paper, tape and sticks made a bundle about 3 feet long and 7 or 8 inches thick, while the rubber made a bundle about 18 or 20 inches long and about 8 inches thick. In all, he estimated, the entire lot would have weighed maybe 5 pounds. It doesn't sound much like an interstellar spacecraft, does it? There was no sign of any metal in the area which might have been used for an engine, and no sign of any propellers of any kind, although at least one paper fin had been glued onto some of the tin foil. There were no words to be found anywhere on the instrument, although there were letters on some of the parts. It would have been handy to, if they'd have detailed what the letters were. Were they English letters? That would have been an interesting thing to know, and what actual letters they're referring to. Considerable Scotch tape and some tape with flowers printed upon it have been used in the construction. No string or wire were to be found, but there were some eyelets in the paper to indicate that some sort of attachment may have been used. Brazel said that he previously found 2 weather balloons on the ranch, but that what he found this time did not in any way resemble either of these. And that's because if it was part of the Mogul project, it would have had attachments on it that would not have looked like a weather balloon. It may have been a bigger balloon, may have been more than one balloon. But it's not going to look the same as weather balloons. And the other thing to consider here, of course, is that if he'd seen weather balloons that come down on his property previously, then wherever these balloons are being launched from, the prevailing winds are prone to blow them over his ranch. So that whether the weather balloons or the Mogul balloons were launched from the same place or not, the fact that he'd had 2 weather balloons land on the property before, it sort of suggests that another balloon could just as easily end up on his property. Okay, so evolution of the event from 1947 to the present. General Ramey's press conference and March and Brazel's statement effectively ended this as a UFO-related matter until 1978. Although some UFO researchers argue there were several obtuse references to it in 1950s-era literature, Roswell, for example, is not referred to in the official United States Air Force investigation of UFOs reported in Project Blue Book, or its predecessors Project Sign and Project Grudge, which ran from 1948 to 1969. And in brackets, which Congressman Schiff subsequently learned when he made his original inquiry, close brackets. In 1978, an article appeared in a tabloid newspaper, the National Enquirer, which reported the former intelligence officer, Jesse Marcel, claimed that he had recovered UFO debris near Roswell in 1947. So this all goes back to one person. That's Jesse Marcel. He's phoned up the paper and claimed he found a flying saucer, not a balloon. One person's story. Also in 1978, a UFO researcher, Stanton Friedman, met with Marcel and began investigating the claims that the material Marcel handled was from a crashed UFO, and Stanton Friedman made a lot of money out of it, and probably was happy to go along with Marcel's story because he knew he'd make plenty of money out of it. He wasn't really interested in the truth or interested in researching the thing thoroughly. Also in 1978, a UFO researcher, I read that bit, with Marcel began investigating the claims. Met with Marcel and began investigating the claims that the material Marcel handled was from a crashed UFO. Similarly, two authors, William L. Moore and Charles Berlitz, also engaged in research which led them to publish a book, The Roswell Incident. In 1980, this book, they reported they had interviewed a number of persons who claimed to have been present at Roswell in 1947 and professed to be either first or second-hand witnesses to strange events that supposedly occurred. Since 1978 to 1980, other UFO researchers, most notably Donald Schmitt and Kevin Randall, claimed to have located and interviewed even more persons with supposed knowledge of unusual happenings at Roswell. These include both civilian and former military persons. Additionally, the Robert Stack hosted television show Unsolved Mysteries, in quote marks, devoted a large portion of one show to a recreation, in quote marks, of the supposed Roswell events. Numerous other television shows have done likewise, particularly during the last several years, and a made-for-TV movie on the subject is due to be released this summer. That's 1994. The overall thrust of these articles, books and shows is that the Roswell incident, in quote marks, was actually the crash of a craft from another world. The US government recovered it and has been covering up, in quote marks, this fact from the American public since 1947, using a combination of disinformation, ridicule and threats of bodily harm to do so. Generally, the US Air Force bears the brunt of these accusations. From the rather benign description of the event, in quote marks, and the recovery of some material as described in the original newspaper accounts, the Roswell incident, in quote marks, has since grown to mythical, if not mystical, proportions in the eyes and minds of some researchers, portions of the media, and at least part of the American public. There are also now several major variations of the Roswell story, in quote marks. For example, it was originally reported that there was only recovery of debris from one site. This has since grown from a minimal amount of debris recovered from a small area to airplane loads of debris from multiple huge debris fields, in quote marks. Likewise, the relatively simple description of sticks, paper, tape and tinfoil has since grown to exotic metals with hieroglyphics and fibre optic-like materials. Most versions now claim that there were two crash sites where debris was recovered, and at the second site the alleged bodies of extraterrestrial aliens were supposedly retrieved. The number of these alien bodies, in quote marks, recovered also varied. These claims are further complicated by the fact that UFO researchers are not in agreement among themselves as to exactly where these recovery sites were located, or even the dates of the alleged crash sites, or alleged crashes rather. Consistently, however, the Army Air Force was accused of securing these sites, recovering all the material therefrom, keeping locals away, and returning the recovered wreckage and bodies, in brackets, to Roswell under extremely tight security for further processing and later exploitation. Once back at Roswell Army Airfield, it's generally alleged that special measures were taken to notify higher headquarters and arrangements made to have recovered materials shipped to other locations for analysis. These locations include Fort Worth, Texas, the home of the 8th Air Force Headquarters, possibly Sandia Base, now Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico, possibly Andrews Army Airfield, Maryland, and always to Wright Field, now known as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. The latter location was the home of T2, which later became known as Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC in brackets, and the Air Material Command, AMC, and would in fact be a logical location to study unknown materials from whatever origin. So, in fact, any unknown materials of interest would have been taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, so that the T2 Technical Intelligence Center could examine whatever it was. So that part is a fact. Most of the Roswell stories that contain the recovery of alien bodies now show them being shipped to Wright Field. Once the material and bodies were dispersed for further analysis and or exploitation, the government in general, and the Army Air Forces in particular, then engaged in covering up all information relating to the alleged crash and recovery, including the use of security oaths to military persons and the use of coercion, in brackets, including alleged death threats to others. This, as theorized by some UFO researchers, has allowed the government to keep the fact that there is intelligent extraterrestrial life from the American public for 47 years. It also supposedly allowed the US government to exploit recovered extraterrestrial materials by reverse engineering them, ultimately providing such things as fiber optics and stealth technology. The in quote marks, death threats, oaths, and close quote marks, and other forms of coercion alleged to have been meted out by the Army Air Force personnel to keep people from talking have apparently not been very effective, as several hundred people are claimed to have come forward, in brackets, without harm, with some knowledge of the Roswell incident, in quote marks, during interviews with non-government researchers and the media. And if you think about it, that Glyn Dennis, you know, the mortician at Roswell, he sits there and says, yeah, there was this red-haired captain who said, if you talk about this, they'll be finding your bones out in the desert. Yet there he was talking about it, relating the story on television and to UFO authors. So obviously, you know, the threat to kill him didn't really carry much weight with him, did he? He either never happened, or he didn't believe they would kill him. I rather suspect the former. Adding some measure of credibility to the claims that have arisen since 1978 is the apparent depth of research of some of the authors and the extent of their efforts. Their claims are lessened somewhat, however, by the fact that almost all of their information came from verbal reports many years after the alleged event occurred. Many of the persons interviewed were in fact stationed at or lived near Roswell during the time in question, and a number of them claimed military service. Most, however, related their stories in their older years, well after the fact. In other cases, the information provided is second or third hand, having been passed through a friend or relative after the principal had died. What is uniquely lacking in the entire exploration and exploitation of the Roswell incident, in quote marks, is official, positive, documentary or physical evidence of any kind that supports the claims of those who allege that something unusual happened. You know, that's what I've been saying. You know, there is no evidence. All it is stories. The Roswell incident is nothing more than stories. Conversely, there has never been any previous documentary evidence produced by those who would debunk the incident to show that something did not happen. Well, that's not easy, is it? Although logic dictates that bureaucracies do not spend time documenting non-events. Yeah, search strategy and methodology. So they're going to tell you here exactly how they went about doing this, and it really is quite thorough. To ensure senior Air Force leadership that there were no hidden or overlooked files that might relate to the Roswell incident, in quote marks, and to provide the Government Audit Office with the best and most complete information available, the Secretary of the Air Force and the AAZ constructed a strategy based on direct tasking from the Office of the Secretary to elicit information from those functional offices and organisations where such information might logically be contained. This included directing searches at current offices where the special or unusual projects might be carried out, as well as historical organisations, archives and record centres over which the Air Force exerted some degree of control. So, you know, they are looking. This is not just a fob off. That someone at some point has said, okay, let's just get to the bottom of this and produce a report. Let's do it right. I want to see everything there is on this, and that's what they're doing here. Well, as I said, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll just go through here and see if I think there are. I'll leave a link to this below, so you can read it in its entirety, and you can read Brazel's statement as well. An example of trying to deal with questionable claims is illustrated by the following example. One of the popular books mentioned that was reviewed claimed that the writers had submitted the names and serial numbers of over 24 personnel stationed at Roswell in July 1947 to the Veterans Administration and the Defense Department to confirm their military service. They then listed 11 of those persons by name and asked the question, in quote marks, why does neither the Defense Department nor the Veterans Administration have records of any of these men when we can document that each served at Roswell Army Airfield, close quote marks. So they're trying to hype it up. The UFO enthusiasts that are writing the books about this stuff are hyping it up by saying that Department of Defense and the Army has no record of these men serving. That claim sounded serious, so the Secretary of the Air Force and the AAZD was tasked to check these 11 names in the Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, using only the names, since the authors did not list the serial numbers. Yeah, using only the names since the authors did not list the serial numbers. Okay, so first thing, name, rank, and serial numbers, the first thing soldiers will give you, isn't it? So, and the researchers are saying, is illustrated, the writers had submitted the names and serial numbers of over 24 personnel stationed at Roswell in July to the Veterans Administration. Okay, but they don't tell us what the numbers are. And they don't tell us what the numbers are because researchers can then do their own research and find that the records are there. And this is what we're going to see, that the Secretary of the Air Force, the GAO, found that to be the case. That claim sounded serious. They didn't like the sound of that. Whether these people's records been expunged. So that claim sounded serious. So they were tasked to check these 11 names in the Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. Using only the names, since the authors did not list the serial numbers, the researchers quickly found the records readily identifiable with 8 of these persons. The other 3 had such common names that there could have been multiple possibilities. Interestingly, one of the listed missing, in quote marks, persons had a casualty report in his records reflecting that he died in 1951, while the writers claim to have interviewed him or a person of the exact same name, because remember they didn't submit the serial numbers, interviewed him in 1990, although someone with that exact same name died in 1951. They can't be sure because the authors of the UFO story aren't providing the serial numbers of the military personnel. Big red flag. Okay, on the part of the UFO crowd. While the historical document search was in progress, it was decided to attempt to locate and interview several persons identified as still living who could possibly answer questions generated by the research. This had never been officially done before, although most of the persons contacted reported that they had also been contacted in the past by some of the listed authors or other private researchers. In order to counter possible future arguments that the persons interviewed were still covering up, in quote marks, material because of prior security oaths, the interviewees were provided with authorization from either the Secretary of the Air Force or the senior security official of the Air Force that would officially allow discussion of classified information, if applicable, or free them from any prior restriction in discussing the matter if such existed. So, any disclosure, anti-disclosure agreements, non-disclosure agreements, they could talk freely. They wouldn't have to worry about anything like that they'd signed. The focus was on interviewing persons that could address specific issues raised by research, and no consideration was given to try and locate every alleged witness claimed to have been contacted by the various authors. For example, one of the interviewees thought vital to obtain an official signed sworn statement from was Sheridan Gov't, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired in brackets, who is the last living member of the 3 persons universally acknowledged to have recovered material from the Foster Ranch. Others were also interviewed as information developed, discussed in detail later in brackets. Additionally, in some cases, survivors of deceased persons were also contacted in an attempt to locate various records thought to have been in the custody of the deceased. Even though Air Force research originally started in January 1994, the first official Air Force-wide tasking was directed by the March 1st, 1994 memorandum. From Secretary of Air Force, Attachment 5, was addressed to those current air staff elements that would be be the likely repository for any records, particularly if there was anything of an extraordinary nature involved. This meant the search was not limited to unclassified materials, but would also include records of the highest classification and compartmentation. And here, this is where they looked: the Directorate of Information Management, Directorate of Electronics and Special Programs, Air Force Safety, Air Force History, Air Force Intelligence, and Air Force Office of Special Investigations, FOSI. So all of these places, any or all of these places would have information on this, if any existed. Especially the last one, I suspect. In addition to the above Air Staff and Secretariat offices, Secretary of Air Force reviewed appropriate classified records for any tie-in to this matter with regard to highly classified records. It should be noted that any programs that employ enhanced security measures or controls are known as Special Access Programs, SAPs. The authority for such programs come from Executive Order, blah, 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 and flows from the Department of Defense. Actually, I've left the 4 out there, haven't they? Special Executive Order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've left the 4 out. I suppose the conspiracy crowd will jump right on that and go, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Yeah, where's the 4? Yeah. And flows from the Department of Defense to the services via Department of Defense Directive 5205.7. These programs are implemented by the Royal Air Force by policy directive, blah, 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 and Air Force instruction, something else. And these directives contain detailed requirements for controlling and reporting in a very strict manner all SAPs, including all SAPs. This includes a report from the Secretary of the Air Force to the Secretary of Defense and ultimately to Congress on all SAPs submitted for approval and certification that there are no SAP-like, in quote marks, programs being operated. These reporting requirements are stipulated in public law. It followed then that if the Air Force had recovered some type of extraterrestrial spacecraft and or bodies and was exploiting this for scientific and technology purposes, then such a program will be operated as an SAP. The Central Office for all Air Force SAPs has knowledge of and security oversight over all SAPs. SAF category stated that no such special access program exists that pertain to extraterrestrial spacecraft or aliens. Likewise, the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff, who head the Special Program Oversight Committee which oversees all sensitive programs in the Air Force, has no knowledge of the existence of any such program involving or relating to the events at Roswell or the alleged technology that supposedly resulted therefrom. Besides the obvious irregularity and illegality of keeping such information from the most senior Air Force officials, it would also be illogical since these officials are responsible for obtaining funding for operations, research, development and security. Without funding, such a program, operation or organization could not exist. Even to keep such a fact in quote marks cover up, it's probably covered up, it should be, in some sort of passive caretaker status in quote marks, would involve money. More importantly, it would involve people and create paperwork. The aforementioned tasking generated negative responses. We got attachments 6 to 12 showing the negative responses from all recipients, i.e. all officers reported they had no information that would explain the incident. Consequently, these negative responses led to an increase in the already ongoing historical research at record centres and archives. And it goes on to say where else they looked, and they looked in an awful lot of places. I mean, if you look at this, they are seriously looking into this and they're trying to find anything they can, and they're not finding anything. As I said, it'll take forever to read out all 22 pages. Okay. Let's just go to this bit here. What the Roswell incident was not. Okay, before discussing specific positive results that these efforts revealed, it's possible it is first appropriate to discuss those things as indicated by information available to the Air Force that the Roswell incident was not. Okay, it was not an airplane crash. Of all things that are documented and tracked within the Air Force, among the most detailed and scrupulous are airplane crashes. In fact, the records of air crashes go back to the first years of military flight. Okay, so it's not a plane crash. It's not a missile crash. Crashed errant missile, usually described as captured German V2, because remember we're talking about 1947 here, or one of its variants, is sometimes set forth as a possible explanation for the debris recovered near Roswell. Since much of this testing done at nearby White Sands was secret at the time, it would be logical to assume that the government would handle any missile mishap under tight security, particularly if the mishap occurred on private land. From the records reviewed by the Air Force, however, there was nothing located to suggest this was the case. Although the bulk of remaining testing records are under the control of the US Army, the subject has also been very well documented over the years within the Air Force records. There will be no reason to keep such information classified today. The USA have found no indicators or even hints that a missile was involved in this matter. It wasn't a nuclear incident. It's not worth reading that one. I think that's pretty obvious. And it was not an extraterrestrial craft. The Air Force research found absolutely no indication that what happened near Roswell in 1947 involved any type of extraterrestrial spacecraft. This, of course, is the crux of this entire matter. The pro-UFO, in quote marks, persons who obtain a copy of this report at this point most probably begin the, quote marks, cover-up is still on, close quote mark claims. Anyone spring to mind? Although I wouldn't class people like Ben Emlyn Jones and Miles Johnston and those sort of people, Richard D. Hall, as pro-UFO persons. Stanton Friedman, the people that make big money out of it, are pro-UFO persons. Nevertheless, the research indicated absolutely no evidence of any kind that a spaceship crashed near Roswell, or that any alien occupants were recovered therefrom. In some secret military operation or otherwise, this does not mean, however, that the early Air Force was not concerned about UFOs. However, in early days, UFO meant unidentified flying object, which literally translates as an object in the air that is not readily identifiable. It did not mean, as the term has evolved in today's language, to equate to alien spaceships. Records from the period reviewed by the Air Force researchers, as well as those cited by the authors mentioned before, do indicate that the United States Air Force was seriously concerned about the inability to adequately identify unknown flying objects reported in American airspace. All the records, however, indicated that the focus of concern was not on aliens, hostile or otherwise, but on the Soviet Union. Many documents from that period speak to the possibility of developmental secret Soviet aircraft overflying US airspace. This, of course, was of major concern to the fledgling United States Air Force, whose job it was to protect these same skies. The research revealed only one official Army Air Force document that indicated there was any activity of any type that pertained to UFOs and Roswell in July 1947. This was a small section of the July historical report for the 509th Bomb Group and Roswell Army Air Force airfield that stated, quote marks, the Office of Public Information was quite busy during the month answering inquiries on the flying disc, which was reported to be in possession of the 509th Bomb Group. The object turned out to be a radar tracking balloon, close quote marks. Additionally, this history showed that the 509th commander, Colonel Blanchard, went on leave on July the 8th, 1947, which would be a somewhat unusual maneuver for a person involved in the supposed first ever recovery of extraterrestrial material. Yeah, because I mean that would be that would really be a spectacular event. You know, that would be well, I mean, you know, as far as human, that would be a huge event in human history, to actually handle, to actually have in your hands technology or biological material, you know, from another planet, from another technological civilization. That would be monumental. Detractors claim Blanchard did this as a ploy to elude the press and go to the scene to direct the recovery operations. It's in brackets. It says the history and the morning reports also showed that the subsequent activities at Roswell during the month were mostly mundane and not indicative of any unusual high-level activity, expenditure of manpower, resources, or security. So business as usual, basically. Likewise, researchers found no indication of heightened activity anywhere else in the military hierarchy in the July 1947 message, traffic, or orders. So no unusual activity across the board. To include classified traffic in brackets, there were no indications and warnings, notice of alerts, or higher tempo of operational activity reported that would be logically generated if an alien craft whose intentions were unknown entered US territory. To believe that such operational and high-level security activity could be conducted solely by relying on unsecured telecommunications or personal contact without creating any records of such activity certainly stretches the imagination of those who have served in the military, who know that paperwork of some kind is necessary to accomplish even emergency, highly classified or sensitive tasks. Somewhere in here as well, it also says that Blanchard arranged, was it Blanchard? He went on leave on July the 8th. Someone else did as well, but it was arranged on July the 5th or something. Oh, June the 5th. We'll get to that. That's a little bit further down. It says, likewise, the researchers found no indication of heightened activity anywhere else in the military hierarchy in July 1940. Orders. Yeah, okay, I've read that bit. So an example of activity sometimes cited by pro-UFO writers is to illustrate the point that something unusual was going on. Was the travel of Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, commander of the Air Materiel Command, to New Mexico in July 1947. Actually, records were located indicating that Twining went to the bomb commander's course on July the 8th, along with a number of other general officers, and requested orders to do so a month before on June the 5th. Okay. So Twining didn't go there, especially because of the Roswell incident. He'd actually arranged to go to Roswell on June the 5th. And Blanchard went on holiday. Who was the commander of the 509th Bomb Group, went on leave on July the 8th. He certainly wouldn't have done that if anything as significant as an alien spacecraft dropping in his backyard had occurred. Yeah, it's just nonsense. Similarly, it's also been alleged that General Hoyt Vandenberg, Deputy Chief of Staff at the time, had been involved directing activity regarding events at Roswell. Activity reports, see attachment 15, located in General Vandenberg's personal papers stored in the Library of Congress, did indicate that on July 7th he was busy with a flying disc incident. However, this particular incident involved Ellington Field, Texas, and the Spokane, in brackets, Washington depot. After much discussion and information gathering on this incident, it was learned to be a hoax. There is no similar mention of his personal interest or involvement in Roswell events, except in the newspapers. The above are but two small examples that indicate that if some event happened that was one of the watershed happenings, in quote marks, in human history, and it certainly would be, to actually have a flying saucer, an alien spacecraft drop in your backyard and actually have it take it away and put it in a shed, that would certainly be a watershed happening. The above are but two small examples that indicate that if some event happened that was one of the watershed happenings in human history, the US military certainly reacted in an unconcerned and cavalier manner. In an actual case, the military would have had to order thousands of soldiers and airmen, not only at Roswell but throughout the US, to act nonchalantly, pretend to conduct and report business as usual, and generate absolutely no paperwork of a suspicious nature, while simultaneously anticipating that 20 years or more later, 20 years or so, or more into the future, people would have available a comprehensive Freedom of Information Act that would give them great leeway to review and explore government documents. The records indicate that none of this happened. And in brackets, or if it did, it was controlled by a security system so efficient and tight that no one, US or otherwise, has been able to duplicate it since. If such a system had been in effect at the time, it would have also been used to protect our atomic secrets from the Soviets, which history has showed obviously was not the case. Close brackets. The records reviewed confirmed that no such sophisticated and efficient security system existed. And then he goes on to say what the Roswell incident was. Okay, as previously discussed, what originally reported to have been recovered was a balloon of some sort, usually described as a weather balloon in quote marks, although the majority of the wreckage was ultimately displayed by General Ramey and Major Marcel in the famous photos, see attachment 16, in Fort Worth, was that of a radar target normally suspended from balloons. This radar target, discussed in more detail later, was certainly consistent with the description of July 9th newspaper article which discussed tinfoil, paper tape and sticks. Additionally, the description of the flying disc was consistent with a document routinely used by most pro-UFO writers to indicate a conspiracy in progress. The telegram from the Dallas FBI office of July 8, 1947, this document quoted in part states the disc is hexagonal in shape and was suspended from a balloon by a cable, which balloon was approximately 20 feet in diameter. The object found resembles a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector, disc and balloon being transported. Similarly, while conducting the popular literature review, so yeah, I think it's good that they actually bothered to read all this stuff, So they're getting these inquiries, and these people are saying this, that, and the other, and that's why they finally done this report. So they're actually reading what's being said out there. Reviewed was a paper entitled "The Roswell Events," edited by Fred Whiting and sponsored by the Fund for UFO Research, FUFOR. Although it was not the original intention to comment on what commercial authors interpreted or claimed that other persons supposedly said, this particular document was different because it contained actual copies of apparently authentic sworn affidavits received from a number of persons who claimed to have some knowledge of the Roswell event. Although many of the persons who provided these affidavits to the FUFOR researchers also expressed opinions that they thought there was something extraterrestrial about this incident, a number of them actually described materials that sounded suspiciously like wreckage from balloons. These included the following. Jesse A. Marcel, son of the late Major Marcel, 11 years old at the time. There were 3 categories of debris: thick foil-like metallic grey substance, brittle brownish-black plastic like Bakelite, fragments of what appeared to be I-beams. I think we've heard this a number of times. 14 years old Bessie Brazel. The debris looked like pieces of a large balloon which had burst. The pieces were small. The largest I remember was about the same diameter as a basketball. Most of it was a kind of double-sided material, foil-like on one side and rubber-like on the other. That might account for you not being able to tear it like ordinary tinfoil. Both sides were greyish-silver in colour, the foil more silvery than the rubber. Sticks like kite sticks were attached to some of the pieces with whitish tape. Is this sounding like an interstellar spacecraft to anybody? The tape was about 2 or 3 inches wide and had flower-like designs on it. The flowers were faint, variety of pastel colours, and reminded me of Japanese paintings in which the flowers were not all connected. I do not recall any types of material or marking, any other types of material or markings, nor do I remember seeing gouges in the ground or any other signs that anything may have hit the ground hard. The foil rubber material could not be torn like ordinary aluminium foil can be torn. 9-year-old Sally Strickland. What Bill showed us was a piece of what I still think as fabric. It was something like aluminium foil, something like satin, something like well-tanned leather in its toughness, yet was not precisely like any one of those materials. It was about the thickness of very fine kidskin glove leather and a dull metallic greyish silver, one side slightly darker than the other. I do not remember it having any design or embossing on it. Flight engineer from a B-29. Signed affidavit. On this occasion, I was a member of the crew which flew parts of what we were told was a flying saucer to Fort Worth. The people on board included Major Jesse Marcel. Captain William E. Anderson said it was from a flying saucer. After we arrived, the material was transferred to a B-25. I was told they were going to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. And might recall from earlier on in the piece that would be fact. If they found anything unusual, they'd take it there because that's where they looked at foreign materials of interest. I was involved in loading the B-29 with the material, which was wrapped in packages with wrapping paper. One of the pieces was triangle shaped, about 2.5 feet across the bottom. Sounds a bit like a radar target, doesn't it? The rest in small packages about the size of a shoebox. The brown paper was held with tape. The material was extremely lightweight. When I picked it up, it was just like picking up an empty package. Well, you'd think balloon materials would be pretty light. We loaded the triangle-shaped package and 3 shoebox-sized packages into the plane. All of the packages could have fit into the trunk of a car. When we came back from lunch, they told us they had transferred the material to a B-25. They told us the material was a weather balloon, but I'm certain it wasn't a weather balloon. Even though he's only seen the packages that have been wrapped up packages, he hasn't actually seen the material, has he? In addition to those persons above still living who claim to have seen or examined the original material found on the Brazil Ranch, there is one additional person who was universally acknowledged to have been involved in its recovery. Sheridan Gov't, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired in brackets. Gov't is credited in all claims of having accompanied Major Marcel to the ranch to recover the debris, sometimes along with his counterintelligence corps subordinate William Rickett, who, like Marcel, is deceased. Although there does not appear to be much dispute that Gov't was involved in the material recovery, other claims about him prevail in the popular literature. He's sometimes portrayed as a closed-mouthed or sometimes even sinister in brackets conspirator who was one of the early individuals to keep the secret of Roswell in quote marks from getting out. Other things about him have been alleged, including the claim that he wrote a report of the incident at the time that has never surfaced. Excuse me. Since Lieutenant Colonel Gov't, who had first-hand knowledge, was still alive, a decision was made to interview him and get a signed, sworn statement from him about his version of the events. Prior to the interview, the Secretary of the Air Force provided him with written authorization and waiver to discuss classified information with the interviewer and release him from any security oath he may have taken. Subsequently, Gov't was interviewed on May the 24th, 1994 at his home. Gov't provided a signed, sworn statement, see attachment 17, of his recollections in this matter. He also consented to having the interview tape recorded. A transcript of that recording is at attachment 18. In this interview, Gov't related that he'd been contacted on numerous occasions by UFO researchers and had willingly talked with many of them. However, he felt that he'd oftentimes been misrepresented or had his comments taken out of context, so that their true meaning was changed. And unfortunately, this is one of these things, with UFO enthusiasts, they'll take things out of context and they'll write it up to give the impression there's something to it when there really isn't, because their bias is that they so desperately want this to be an alien spacecraft. They want to sell their story. If it's not an alien spacecraft, they're not going to sell any copies of their book, are they? That's the bottom line with that. He stated unequivocally, however, that the material he recovered consisted of a reflective sort of material like aluminium foil and some thin bamboo-like sticks. He thought at the time, and continued to do so today, that what he found was a weather balloon, and has told other private researchers that. He also remembered finding a small, in quote marks, black box type of instrument, which he thought at the time was probably a radio sonde. Lieutenant Colonel Gov't also reviewed the famous Ramey Marcel photographs, see attachment 16, of the wreckage taken to Fort Worth, in brackets, often claimed by LITO researchers to have been switched and the remnants of a balloon substituted for it, close brackets, and he identified the materials depicted in those photos as consistent with the materials he recovered from the ranch. So Gov't is saying that the materials that Marcel was holding up in the famous photographs in Ramey's office are the materials that they recovered. They weren't switched. The real flying saucer materials weren't taken away and he was handed bits of balloon. They were the materials that Gov't and Brazil found. They all recovered. Lieutenant Colonel Gov't also stated that he'd never taken any oath or signed any agreement not to talk about this incident and had never been threatened by anyone in the government because of it. He did not even know the incident, in quote marks, was claimed to be anything unusual until he was interviewed in the early 1980s. Similarly, Irving Newton, Major, United States Air Force, retired, was located and interviewed. Newton was a weather officer assigned to Fort Worth who was on duty when the Roswell debris was sent there in July 1947. He was told he was to report to General Ramey's office to review the material. In a signed sworn statement, see attachment 30, Newton related that, "I walked into the General's office where this supposed flying saucer was lying all over the floor. As soon as I saw it, I giggled and asked if that was the flying saucer. I told them that this was a balloon and a Rowan target." Newton also stated that while I was examining the debris, Major Marcel was picking up pieces of the target sticks and trying to convince me that some notations on the sticks were alien writings. There were figures on the sticks, lavender or pink in colour, appeared to be weather-faded markings with no rhyme or reason. He did not convince me that these were alien writings. Newton concluded his statement by relating that during the ensuing years I've been interviewed by many authors. I've been quoted and misquoted. The facts remain as indicated above. I was not influenced during the original interview, nor today, to provide anything but what I know to be true. That is, the material I saw in General Raymond's office was the remains of a balloon and a Rowan target. Excuse me. Now, the original tasking, I won't read all this out, but you can read it. You can read it for yourself. Let's go on to. It does actually say that they there was a group conducting this research, launched a balloon that was never recovered by them. So it's probably the one that was recovered from Brazil's ranch. Hang on, let's just see if I can survive this video. Excuse me. An advanced ground team led by Albert P. Crary preceded the NYU group to Alamogordo Air Force Base, New Mexico, setting up ground sensors and obtaining facilities for the NYU group. Upon their arrival, Professor Moore and his team experimented with various configurations of neoprene balloons, development of balloon trains, see illustration attachment 25, automatic ballast systems, and use of naval sonobuoys, in brackets, as the Watson Lab acoustical sensors had not yet arrived. They were the Watson Labs will be the people that made the acoustical sensors that were supposed to detect these Soviet nuclear detonations. They also launched what they called service flights. These service flights were not logged nor fully accounted for in the published technical reports generated as a result of the contract between NYU and the Watson Labs. According to Professor Moore, the service flights were composed of balloons, radar reflectors, and payloads specifically designed to test acoustic sensors. This sounds like the sort of thing that Brazil found. Both early sonobuoys and the later Watson Lab devices. The payload equipment was expendable, and some carried no reward or return to tags because there was no association between these flights and the logged constant altitude flights, which were fully acknowledged. The NYU balloon flights were listed subsequently in their reports. Yet gaps existed for flights 2 to 4 and flight 9. The interview with Professor Moore indicated these gaps were the unlogged service flights. Professor Moore, the on-scene project engineer, gave detailed information concerning his team's efforts. He recalled that radar targets were used for tracking balloons because they did not have all the necessary equipment when they first arrived in New Mexico. So basically they didn't have equipment to put on them so they could see the balloon, because balloons are hard to see with radar. They would stick a radar target on it so they could track it. Some of the early developmental radar targets were manufactured by a toy novelty company. These targets were made of aluminium foil-backed paper, balsa wood beams that were coated in an Elmer S-type glue to enhance their durability, acetate and/or cloth reinforcing tape, single-strand and braided nylon twine, brass eyelets and swivels to form multifaceted reflector, somewhat similar in construction to a box kite. See photographs, attachment 26. Some of these targets were also assembled with purplish pink tape with symbols on. See drawing by Moore with attachment 2.1. Okay. So I think what they found is what Brazel and Co found was with one of these balloons. I mean, they fit precisely the materials that were involved. In Moore's scientific opinion, most probably from Flight 4. Okay, let's just start a little bit further up. Upon review of the local newspaper photographs from General Ramey's press conference in 1947 and descriptions in popular books by individuals who supposedly handled the debris recovered on the ranch, Professor Moore opined that the material was most likely the shredded remains of a multi-neoprene balloon train with multiple radar reflectors. The material and black box in quote marks described by Gov't was, in Moore's scientific opinion, most probably from Flight 4, a service flight that included a cylindrical metal sonobuoy and portions of a weather instrument housed in a box, which was unlike typical weather radiosondes, which were made of cardboard, which is why Brazel would have said he'd not seen anything like it before, because the two weather balloons he'd seen before were the typical ones. This was not a typical weather balloon. Additionally, a copy of a professional journal maintained at the time by A.P. Crary, provided to the Air Force by his widow, showed that Flight 4 was launched on June the 4th, 1947, but was not recovered by the NYU group. It's very probable that this top-secret project balloon train, Flight 4, made up of unclassified components, came to rest some miles northwest of Roswell, became shredded in the surface winds, and was ultimately found by the rancher, Brazel, 10 days later. This possibility was supported by the observations of Lieutenant Colonel Gov't, the only living witness to the actual debris field and the material found. Lieutenant Colonel Gov't described a small area of debris which appeared to resemble bamboo-type square sticks 1/4 to 1/2 inch square that were very light, as well as some of the metallic reflecting material that was also very light. I remember recognizing this material as being consistent with a weather balloon. Okay, this has been a little bit over an hour, so I'll probably wrap this up. But as I say, you can read this for yourself. I'll leave a link to this below, and I'll leave a link to Brazel's statement below, Mac Brazel's statement below. Concerning the initial announcement, RAAF captured flying disc, in quote marks, research failed to locate any documented evidence as to why that statement was made. However, on July 10, 1947, following the Ramey press conference, the Alamogordo News published an article with photographs demonstrating multiple balloons and targets at the same location as the NYU group operated from Alamogordo Army Airfield. Professor Moore expressed surprise at seeing this since his was the only balloon test group in the area. He stated it appears that was some type of umbrella cover story to protect our work with Mogul. Although the Air Force did not find documented evidence that General Ramey was directed to espouse a weather balloon in his press conference, he may have done so because he was either aware of Project Mogul and was trying to deflect interest from it, or he'd readily perceived the material to be a weather balloon based on the identification from his weather officer, Irving Newton. In either case, the materials recovered by the Army Air Force in July 1947 were not readily recognizable as anything special. In brackets, only the purpose was special, and the recovered debris itself was unclassified. Additionally, the press dropped its interest in the matter as quickly as they jumped onto it. Hence, there'd be no particular reason to further document what quickly became a non-event. All right, well, I'll leave it there, I think, but as you can see, these people have looked into this very thoroughly. They've said, okay, what's been written about this subject? Let's see if there's anything to it. And they found that, surprise, surprise, there is nothing to it. This is from July 1994, Roswell Incident, and it's from the NSA.gov website. Okay, so as I said before, it's not some, it's not some UFO enthusiast that lives in a bedsit in a basement, or spends all his time making UFO documentaries in a garden shed. This is freedom of information stuff. It was compiled for a congressman rather. And when they say, what have we got on UFOs, they're going to be particularly interested in Roswell because this is so thorough, comprehensive. This investigation they've done here. And this is what's going to be submitted. So I think all we're going to see is this again. and they'll say there was no new evidence to warrant revisiting the Roswell story. So this is going to be it as far as Roswell is concerned. All right, well, so there we go. There was no alien, no crash of any. There's no zero evidence, documentation, not a shred of any evidence whatsoever to suggest to support the story that it was the crash of an alien spacecraft. And there's no evidence to support they recovered any material, biological or technological, from Roswell, that Roswell crash site. It was a balloon. That's the bottom line. So thanks for watching as always. I'm sorry this has gone on for so long. I hope you're still awake. And if not, I hope this was an aid to overcoming your insomnia. And I'll catch you probably in the not too distant future. Cheerio for now.